Hi, it's Craig. Today we're going to be talking about the match game again. It focuses on the lists and dictionaries. So the match game is a basic game where you have either 4 or 16 tiles on a screen, and you click on one of the squares and it'll show a color, and the objective is to get a match in the least amount of time as possible. So this particular game will use 16 cells. It's also reconfigurable with just a variable to be 4 cell. That's better for testing. It'll have 8 colors. It'll work on the Android phone. We'll have touchscreen capability, and the programming things we'll learn are lists, dictionaries, libraries, and objects. So although this game is deceptively simple, you would think it's a simpler game to create on a phone. It's actually a little bit more complex. I want to show you some other examples of what we did before we got here. So the simplest game I did with my son was this type of shooter game using a joystick, and you shoot these various airplanes or parachutes coming off the screen. He did this when he was in middle school. There's this type of game where it's a scrolling game and you jump over various things coming at you, and the background is scrolling from right to left, so it gives you the appearance that you're running. This type of game is also pretty simple, where there's a map loader. It's a tile-based game, and you have some girl running around. You could make these things be either you run over these various objects, or you make it so it's impenetrable. But these are actually a lot simpler than doing a match type of game where, well, that was a match. Where you try to get a match. And the reason for this problem is, well, okay, so let's first look at what we have to do. We have to create lists, dictionaries, libraries, and objects. When you try to make the match game, you're going to have to randomize colors. There's max 2 colors per grid. This means you're going to have to track the occurrences of each color. And then if the colors are already appeared twice on the screen, when you first populate the screen, you're going to need to keep generating a new random number until an open color is found, which means you have to track all the colors that have been found. In the other types of shooter games, you're not really tracking the state of that many objects based on human interaction. So if it's a bullet, that type, or a bomb in a game, the user is not really interacting until the bomb or the bullet intersects with another object. At that point, you can take some action. But in this case, it was a little bit more difficult to figure out how to store the colors. And I'll show you the code to make it more understandable. You have to redraw the cover squares. So, let's see. When you make the first selection, so let's say you make the first selection. So at this stage, when you press the button again, you want another square to be uncovered. But if you press it a third time, you want both of them to be covered again, unless it's a match. So you press one, you press the other. Oh, this was a match. So if I press it again, I want the 2 red ones to stay up, and it stays up. I click on that. Oh, that was a match. not a match, and then I press again and they get covered. It's not a match. So you have to redraw the cover square after the second selection. You need to use a counter to track the first or second square selected, and then check for a match. I'll get into the individual segments. You import the libraries. You try to import the Android library. This is for the mobile phone. If not, just set the Android library to none. So I first use an object for this. It's a very simple object for the first square. There's no methods to it. It just has a set of attributes. So for this program, we're using objects, list, dictionary, and library. The main object is a square. Kept as simple as possible. There's no methods to this object. It has a Pygame rectangle as one of the 4 attributes. It has a color, and it has two Boolean variables. One's a flag for match, either true or false. That means the square has been matched. Or a trigger, which is a Boolean variable to make it whether the square is viewable or not. So in this section here, and I'll show it again, in the initialization method, we're going to load a rectangle that's going to be passed to it. It's a Pygame rectangle. It has all the coordinates for the rectangle. The color of the rectangle, this is the base layer where it's multicolored. Whether it has been matched or not, the default being false because we haven't started the game yet, and whether that whether it's viewable. Initially, it's going to be covered up, so it's not viewable initially. We wanted the user to click on the square first, and then it becomes viewable. So initially, it's not viewable. I have a constant for the grid size. There's 16 grids here. I could have set it to 4. The screen size is set to the screen size of the phone. I'm using a Samsung Galaxy Note 2 for this. It'll automatically resize. I just set it to the exact size of it. Max color occurrences 2, which is the you could set it so that there is 4 squares of the same color, but I set mine to 2. And then I have some colors. So I'm calling up another library here. If you know in the beginning, I'm importing a grid library. So in my directory, I've created another file for a grid library that loads the colors and the coordinates of the initial grid. I'll cover it. Okay, this is the key section here. It's the color occurrence. This was actually pretty difficult. You want to track to see how many times the color has occurred, whether it's 0, 1, or 2 times. And the reason for that is we want to avoid a situation where the color occurs more than 2 times. Okay, so let's go back to the components. Main one, an object, showed you. It stores different attributes: the rectangle, the color of the background square, Boolean variable for the match, and a Boolean variable to trigger whether it's viewable or not. There's a list to store all the squares. So when you instantiate one of the objects, it'll create one square with these 4 attributes. You're going to want to store each of the squares into a list. So I call it the list squares list. There's a dictionary to store all the colors and number of the occurrences of each color, and there's a separate external library on a file, grid_library.py saves a separate file. Here's the main square. Very simple, 4 attributes. Here's a loop to populate the grid. So this will create 16 squares at the correct x and y coordinates for the grid. So there's a screen height. That's the height of the screen we set from the screen size, and the height of each square. Height of the square being you're dividing the number of squares by the screen height to calculate. Then you set the rectangle. Then you assign a color for each square. Initially, you make a random choice. So this is a new command here. Random.choice will pull a random item from a list. You need to import the random library here in line 2. So this is new. Do random.choice, and it's the name of the list. This list of color names, there's 8 color names. So you define the color, RGB values here. And this section here will have 8 colors in the list. So this random choice will pull out 1 color name out of 8. And then it checks to see if the color occurrence of that particular color is greater than the max number of occurrences, which is 2, because you only want 2 colors per screen. So that's a dictionary. You created a color occurrence dictionary here. It goes through each color in the color list name, and there's 8. Just showed it to you. It's going to populate it with a key value. It's going to update the dictionary with the color, like for example red in decimal form, the triple tuple, and the number of occurrences will be 0. If it's less than 2 occurrences, it's going to populate the key value, set and increment the color key, the number of occurrences by 1. So the occurrences the value for that key will become 1 the first time, and then it'll become 2. So if it's red as a key, the value initially is 0. The first time through it, it'll become 1, because the red will have been displayed 1 time. The next time through it, it'll become 2. So what happens if there's already 2 red squares on the screen, or 2 dark green squares? Well, if it's already greater than 2, or 2 or more, you populate it with you generate another random choice from the grid. And then if this number is um, if it's, for example, red, if it's occurred already more than twice or more, it's going to keep regenerating another number until. So, for example, the next time it'll find white, it'll find yellow, it'll find light green, it'll find this kind of pale blue. So it's going to keep generating a new number until the occurrence is less than 2, and then I'll add that color again to it. So this is the key loop here. This is where a lot of people get stuck. So once you have the color, and each color occurs no more than 2 times, then it's pretty simple. You just create the square. The square is an object, if you remember. The color, so you create the square, and then you append the square to the square list, and it'll loop through it 16 times. So that's very easy once you get the color. So, and then you're clicking on the grid to uncover each square. So the first time you click on the square, you want it to make it viewable. So for squares and squares list, if the square viewable trigger is true, you don't need equals to true, it'll just take it. Then you draw you insert a rectangle. You draw a rectangle, and then you set the first selection to the number of the square. So I'm using a list here of the squares list. I'm taking the index of that particular square. So if it's the 4th square in the row, so let's see if it's 4 across. If it's in that upper right-hand corner, the index number will be 3, and the first selection that is clicked is 3. Then you simply display the second square with a similar algorithm. So if the square is viewable, you just pop it up. Then you check for the match. I guess this is the exciting part. You check the current index to see if it's equal to the if it's not equal to the first selection. Then you set it up. Then you have the 2 colors that you are generating from the index of squares. So if you remember, okay, I'll go back. So you have the object, right? So the squares list is just a list of these objects. One of the attributes is the rectangle, one of the attributes is the color. So if you know the index number for this list, you'll be able to find the color. Let's go back down. So it's the list. Then you have an index number here. So this is an integer. It's 0 through 15. And that square will have an attribute for the color. That's the first color. And then you do the same thing. This is an integer. This is a list. And so the integer between 0 and 15 will access that one square. That's 0 to 15. So if the 15 square, it's all the way in the lower right-hand corner of the grid. And it'll display the color. That's the second color. So obviously if the first color equals the second color, it's a match. And then you set the attribute match from this square to true. And then the second one is also true. think this is a pretty difficult concept to get. You have to understand what squares, what the list is. So this up to here will return you one object, one square. But if you remember, the square has all these attributes. The square has the rect, it has the color, the two main ones. So when you're checking it, this is a square, and then the dot match will access that Boolean variable to see if the match is true. Okay, that's the last slide. Let's check out the code again. Of course, there's a few more lines of code that you have to add in, but those are the primary primary algorithms. And once you do that, you've also got it running on the phone.